The rain pounded the asphalt, breaking into thousands of icy drops. The narrow streets were drowning in darkness, cut only by the dim light of lanterns that flickered like dying stars. The air was heavy with dampness, smoke and something invisible but palpably ominous. In this city, night was more than just a time of day, it was a reflection of the terror that lurked in the hearts of its inhabitants. People walked with quick steps, bundled up in their coats, avoiding eye contact. No one made eye contact here, no one asked questions. Once they had seen something scary, they had learned to look away. It was their only way to survive. On one of the narrow streets, between decrepit brick houses, stood a two-story wooden house that seemed too dilapidated to withstand another winter storm. A faint light burned inside, illuminating the small kitchen where 3 people sat at the table, an elderly man in a wheelchair, his daughter, and her 5-year-old son. It was their quiet evening, wrapped in the warmth of a faint electric fireplace and the smell of a modest dinner. "Grandpa, can I have more milk?" the boy asked, holding out the mug with his small hands. The old man smiled, but his gaze was heavy. He had seen too much in his life. Too much pain. Too much injustice. "Sure, kid," his voice was low and husky, like a man who didn't just live, but survived. The woman poured the milk silently, but there was something about her movements that betrayed anxiety. She glanced quickly at the window, where the shadows shook behind her. Suddenly there were thuds from the street. First one, then another. It was as if someone was running, chased by the darkness. Then a loud cry of despair. The girl flinched, her hand twitching, spilling milk on the table. "What is it?" the boy whispered, snuggling fearfully against his grandmother's side. The old man frowned, rolling up the sleeves of his worn shirt. "It's the city, kid," he replied bitterly. "It never sleeps, and it never forgives." Red and blue lights flashed outside the window. Sirens cut through the silence, and a hateful voice came through the rain. "Face down, motherfucker." A thud. A scream. The crack of something fragile. The woman froze, hugging her son tightly. She knew this wasn't just an accident. She knew the city was at it again. And the rain continued to pour. The rain didn't stop. It drummed on the roof, streaming down the window panes as if the city itself were trying to wash away the sins that had accumulated over the years. In the semi-darkness of the room sat a man. His skin was darker than the night itself, and his face was riddled with wrinkles, each with its own story of pain. He sat upright in his wheelchair, despite the weight of his years. He didn't let fate bend him, even though his legs had long since refused to serve him. His name was Walter Green. In the past he had been a strong, tall, muscular man, but times had changed. He once walked, ran, laughed, danced, but now his only companions were the wheels of his chair and his memories. He knew this town. Knew its smells, its sounds, its hatred. He'd grown up here, in these dirty alleys, seen neighbors disappear, seen the guys he played basketball with in the backyard suddenly find themselves behind bars or worse. He knew how the system worked. His first break came at 16, when a white policeman hit him with a baton for standing on a street corner too long. Loitering idly, the report called it. His ribs were broken, but he survived. The second time he was beaten was at 21, when he tried to protect his younger brother from 3 cops. Then he was taken to the station, where he was beaten for hours so as not to leave any visible marks. He never gave up, but life broke him again and again. And then there was the day his life was turned upside down. Shot. One single shot that had blown everything out of proportion. The bullet had pierced his spine, leaving only a faint ghostly tingling in his legs, barely enough to remember that he had once been able to walk. It had been an accident. At least that's what the court had said. The police officer who'd fired the shot stayed on duty. Walter stayed in his wheelchair. From then on, he lived quietly. Avoided trouble as much as possible. But trouble was finding him on its own. Walter looked at his daughter. There was alarm in her eyes. She had heard what he had heard. The shouting in the street, the sound of a punch, the shout of a policeman. "Stay here," he said quietly. "Daddy." Her voice trembled. "Just stay here." He pushed the wheels with force, steering his chair toward the door. His movements were firm, his hands, strong, wiry, knew how to drive the damn thing. The rain poured down outside, reflecting the light of the police flashers that illuminated the pavement with ominous blue flashes. A young boy was kneeling in the middle of the street. His face was covered with blood, and above him towered the massive figure of the officer, who at that moment was raising his baton for another blow. It's too familiar a scene. Walter gripped the armrests of his chair. He'd seen it all his life. Seen his brothers beaten. Seen bones broken, destinies shattered. The policeman looked up, noticing Walter. He grinned. "What are you looking at, old man? You want in on this, too?" Somewhere in the back of Walter's mind, rage was boiling. He knew this town. But did the city know him? Walter slowly rolled out into the rain, toward the policeman. "Let him go," his voice was calm, but you could hear the metal in it. The policeman laughed. It was the rough, nasty laugh of a man who is not afraid of consequences. "And if you don't?" He took a step closer, looming like a predator. Walter's daughter ran outside, her eyes burning with fear. "Dad, please." But it was too late. The policeman was already taking a step toward him. It was raining. It was just getting started. Before we continue, let's pause for a moment. Share with us in the comments where you are listening to our stories from. Has there been something similar in your life? We care about your opinions and experiences. If you like what we're creating, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on exciting new chapters. And now we continue. Walter and his daughter walked down the street, trying not to attract unnecessary attention. The darkening sky and the smell of bitter rain falling to the ground filled the air with despair. But although the city seemed dark and empty, its streets were still familiar. Every step on those stone slabs was old and familiar to Walter, but with each passing day his confidence gradually faded like the faded carpet beneath his feet. Her daughter walked beside her, her face growing grave with gloom. She couldn't stop thinking about the screams they'd heard a few minutes ago. And the police cars. And about the fact that it was all too close. "Don't worry, dear," Walter said, trying to get her attention back. "Everything will be all right. We'll be home soon." But, as always, his words sounded not like certainty, but like an attempt to quiet his own fear. Suddenly there was a noise in the silence, the roar of an engine, the woozy sound of a police patrol sliding across the wet pavement. Walter squirmed a little, feeling his back tense. But he tried not to show his daughter any fear. The police were not uncommon here. To men like him, they were a familiar evil. But this patrol here, it didn't promise anything good. The car stopped right in front of them, and two policemen got out. One was tall, with a thick neck and a cruel expression. The other was thin-faced and seemingly calmer, but no less suspicious. "Hey, buddy," the tall policeman said, looking at Walter with a grin that would have broken any nerves. "You got a permit to ride down the street on that?" He pointed to the wheelchair as if Walter were guilty of some terrible crime. His daughter took a step back, her eyes narrowed with fear. Walter felt her body tense and realized the moment had come. This wasn't just a chance encounter. This was a trap. "No, I don't have permission," Walter said, trying to hide his anxiety. "But perhaps you have questions I could answer." "Oh, yes, I have questions," the policeman replied with a smirk, looking straight into Walter's eyes. He leaned forward, almost touching his face. "What do you think, you goddamn bastard? You think you're allowed to ride the streets the way you want?" Suddenly, his hand slammed into Walter's shoulder, pushing him so hard that the chair nearly overturned. Walter tried to keep his balance, but his body could no longer support such force. His daughter shrieked, flying up to him for support. "Daddy!" Her voice was full of terror. "Please don't touch him." The policeman laughed, looking back at his partner. She watched silently, not deciding to intervene. But Walter saw her gaze slide from him to her partner, and realized that her silence was consent. "What, are you protecting your old man, little one?" He smirked, addressing his daughter in a sinister voice. "There's nothing to protect. He's nothing. And you're nothing. It's not going to work out with you anyway." The words cut like knives. Every time the policeman opened his mouth, he struck again. Pain flashed in Walter's eyes. The pain he had long been accustomed to hiding was now impossible to suppress. It was as if the whole past had reappeared, every humiliation, every broken life. It was as if that policeman was breaking his back again. But it wasn't just his life at stake now. It was his daughter's life. And she was not to be a part of this cruel game. The policeman bent down again, approaching her. "You don't know that your father lost his right to freedom a long time ago, girl," he said softly, so that only she could hear him. "And you seem to be starting to delude yourself too, believing that people like you can be something in this town. In this life." The rage and despair that had taken hold of Walter turned into a silent struggle, a desire to make a difference, even if his body could no longer follow it. He felt his heart pounding frantically, but he didn't give up. This was his daughter. He couldn't let her see him give up. "Go away," he said quietly, not holding back the pain in his voice. "You don't understand anything. We are not like you. We're human. And you can't break us." The policeman looked at him, clearly surprised at what he had heard. His anger subsided for a moment, but only for a moment. "You don't get it at all, old man," he said, stepping closer to Walter. "Nothing's going to change. You'll always be nothing, and will always be on top." His daughter squeezed his hand, and Walter felt her fingers trembling. Those words were the same as always. The cruelty he'd endured was now part of her world. But it couldn't be the end. It couldn't be the end. The city shrank into the moment. The sounds of sirens, the rumble of rain, and the menacing shadows of the police car around Walter and his daughter created an atmosphere in which every step seemed decisive. He felt the tension growing inside as his daughter squeezed his hand. She was frightened, but she did not take her eyes off the policeman, trying to find at least a trace of humanity in him. The policeman stood in front of him, laughing almost mockingly. "You think this is going to end peacefully, don't you?" His voice was as sharp as a knife blade. He brought his finger up to Walter's face, almost touching it, and then pushed it away with such force that the chair rocked backward. Walter nearly lost his balance. His hands touched the wheels, but it wasn't enough to keep himself from falling. His heart was beating so hard that he did not immediately realize what was happening. But his daughter, unable to bear it, cried out. "Daddy!" The words were like a cry from the very depths of her soul, like a last desperate call that frustrated all attempts to keep calm. Walter turned to her, and for a moment his gaze was stony. He saw how she trembled, how her body froze in terror. Had she, too, already begun to believe that here, on these streets, they could be nothing? "Don't you dare touch him!" she shrieked, standing between the policeman and her father. She didn't realize that her bravery could only exacerbate the situation, but there was such sincere determination in her eyes that Walter couldn't help but be proud of her, even in that moment. The policeman, smiling gloatingly, looked at her and stepped forward. He slowly extended his arm, taking his time to scare her. It was obvious to him that the girl was afraid, that she didn't know how to act. And he was ready to take advantage of that. "Oh, so you want to play, girl?" His voice was hoarse with anger. He reached out, trying to grab her shoulder, but Walter stepped between them, gritting his teeth. "Don't touch her, bitch," Walter hissed, despite his weakness. It wasn't just a warning, it was a scream that tore at his inner emptiness. He tried to be strong, but he knew the situation was already out of his control. He could feel the policeman noticing it. The policeman could not stand it. His eyes flashed with rage. He lunged forward and shoved Walter violently in the chest, causing him to jerk backward. The chair shrieked on the uneven pavement, and Walter gripped the wheels tighter, feeling the familiar pain. But the pain was not the main thing now. The main thing was different. The cop was becoming more aggressive by the minute, and the limits of what could be tolerated were disappearing. The crowd watching from the sidelines began to tense up. Some people took out their phones, some whispered something in the ear of their neighbors, and some were already coming closer, trying to intervene. "You have no right to," began one man in the crowd, but his words disappeared under the sharp gaze of the second policeman, who stood motionless, his hand already on his holster. It was a silent signal to everyone around him. "Get away from here," he said, not moving, only quietly but insistently. And those who approached began to back away, unwilling to take the risks. And that was the moment when Walter realized that they were both, with his daughter and with him, all alone in this situation. The policeman, ignoring the crowd, began to insult Walter even louder, his words sounding like blows. "You are nothing. Your daughter are nothing. You have no place in this town. You're just sitting there in that chair, and you'll stay there. Too dirty, too dark. You'll never get justice." Every word was like a ligature around his neck, but Walter knew that the most important thing now was not to lose control. He looked at his daughter, who was trying to hold back tears but couldn't. The policeman approached again, now with aggression in every step. He brought his hand toward Walter and pushed his chair again, but this time with even more force, almost knocking it over. The fate of the city was hanging in the balance at that moment. There was silence all around, but it was deceptive. People were waiting. Waiting to see what would happen next. Would this be the end for Walter and his daughter? Or would someone in the crowd finally decide to intervene? All the energy, all the heat, made Walter feel the last sparks of desperation and will begin to flare in his eyes. No matter what happened, he couldn't back down. Walter gritted his teeth, feeling his body shake with pain and rage. The chair rocked again, its wheels squeaking, and the pain in his chest continued. Each breath became harder and harder to take. But there was something else, something inside that wouldn't let him break. It wasn't just pride. It was determination. Determination to fight. For himself. For his daughter. For those who never had a voice. Finally, the crowd began to react. The whispers that had begun with a single word soon turned into muffled conversations, then into indignant shouts. People who had previously preferred not to get involved began to lose patience. Some didn't care that they were being filmed on their phones. They had already seen what was happening. Their silence and fear could not continue. "Is this normal?" shouted one man, pulling his cell phone out of his pocket. "Is this really the best they can do?" He raised the camera and pointed it at the policeman, which immediately attracted the attention of others. First a few people started watching, then more, and now several phones were pointed in the direction of this disgrace. The policeman noticed them. There was a glint of discontent in his eyes, but fear crept into his actions. People began to press, and it wasn't just resentment, it was defiance. In that instant, the policeman lost at least some of his control. He seemed to be beginning to realize that the situation was quickly getting out of his hands. "Get the cameras out. Get them out now." His voice rang out like an order, but no one listened. People kept filming, and that only made him angrier. The officer stepped forward and swung to push away one of the men with the phone. He tried to break the space between himself and the growing crowd, but each step he took made the atmosphere more and more tense. People began to shout, demanding an end to the violence. Some shouted slogans about rights, some cursed the police, but all this was just adding oil to the fire. Fear began to accumulate in the air like smoke. Walter saw it. He could see the tension rising, everything around him turning into a whirlwind of emotion. He heard shouts, saw people standing and shouting for him, but there was something in those shouts that felt like an abyss. His gaze was fixed on his daughter. She didn't take her eyes off the policeman. She couldn't back down, and her firmness was helping him hold on. But then the policeman approached again, his face covered with sweat. He wasn't so confident anymore. His hands were beginning to tremble, he could feel all those eyes, all those cameras, all that attention to his actions pressing in. His voice became sharply muffled. "I said leave, all of you, or you'll be guilty too." His hand clenched into a fist again, he tried to threaten, but his voice was no longer as confident as before. He was beginning to realize that he was failing. The crowd froze, but did not disappear. At this point, everyone seemed to freeze in anticipation. No one knew what would happen next. Everyone was waiting to see who would make the first move. Someone in the crowd shouted, "We will not be silent. We see what's going on." And then, at this moment, when the air seemed almost unbearable, someone from the crowd stepped forward. A middle-aged woman, her voice firm, her steps sure. She was not afraid to approach the policeman. She knew what she had to do. "You have no right." Her words were as powerful as a punch. She stopped in front of the policeman, unafraid of his threats and aggression. "Don't touch him. It's not his fault you're here, you're a lawbreaker." Her words were the final spark. The crowd responded to them. People began to move forward, to stand beside Walter and his daughter. There was no more fear, no more silence. Everyone realized that if they didn't speak up now, if they didn't speak out, this moment, this opportunity would be lost. But the policeman could not understand how his loss of control could have led to such a turn. He didn't know what to do, his hands began to tremble. His partner stood aside, his face invisible, but he did not interfere, only watched. "Everybody out." The policeman shouted again, but this time his voice was not so confident. He looked frightened. Everyone in the crowd saw him lose face, his aggression replaced by fear. At that moment, his boldness disappeared. Silence filled the air for a second. But it was so tense, you could feel it. Inside everyone standing near Walter was tension, like a taut string ready to break at any moment. Everyone knew that this would be the moment of truth. What will happen in the next moment? Will people be able to win this fight for justice, or will things go back to the way they were? The silence, which seemed almost inhuman, was instantly shattered when the policeman grabbed Walter by the shoulders. It was like a steel grip gripping his body tightly. He was already on edge, at his limit. Every muscle ached, every breath was a groan, but he was still sitting in the chair, still standing against this merciless force. But now, with the policeman so close, Walter felt his life begin to slip from his hands. The policeman couldn't help himself. He was so angry, so sure of his right to do violence, that he made a decision that would scar not only Walter's body but also his spirit forever. "Do you think we're afraid of you?" The policeman's voice sounded so gloating that he seemed to take pleasure in humiliating Walter. "You're not worth sitting in that chair, old man." He pushed him with such force that the chair literally flipped over. Walter found himself on the ground, his body meeting the dirty asphalt, and his mouth dropped open as pain shot up his back, pumping through every nerve. He let out a sound that didn't sound like a normal cry of pain, it was something like an echo of humiliation, something that would kill anyone. Walter's daughter, standing nearby, cried out, her face contorted with horror. She clenched her hands, trying not to fall to the ground with him. Her eyes full of fear and helplessness could not look away from her father's body, which lay on the wet pavement. The policeman didn't stop. He grabbed Walter by the collar and yanked him so that he lifted himself up, only to sink back down into the dirt. The force was so devastating that Walter felt his jaw nearly break. There was nothing he could do but powerlessly try to keep his face from hitting the ground. You are worthless. The policeman continued, his every cry soaked with anger, racism and destruction. You are nothing but dirt, just like your daughter. You can't be our equal. We are here and you don't even deserve to be alive. Those words struck more blows than any physical ones. It wasn't just violence, it was soul-destroying. Walter couldn't answer. He knew that his strength was running out, that every response was another extra blow. The daughter couldn't take it anymore. Her voice broke with a scream as she stepped forward, trying to rush toward her father. Stop! Stop! She shouted, holding her hands out in front of her as if she were trying to stop this nightmare with her determination alone. She was defenseless, but her eyes burned with a fury that was stronger than fear at this moment. But her screams didn't stop the policeman. He raised his hand, about to punch Walter in the face, and at that moment everything froze. His partner, the silent observer, finally got off the ground, stepped forward, but had no time to intervene before the policeman struck. Light, but powerful, with such force that Walter felt his face swell and his eyes fill with mist. Everyone involved in this scene could feel it consuming everything around them. It was like the worst thing imaginable, but there was a danger in the air that things were just beginning to escalate. The crowd, which had previously been passive, now began to move. A few people, perhaps desperately, perhaps to get some relief, began to step forward. The woman who had initially stood next to Walter broke out of the crowd again, her voice now sounding like more than a mere protest. You have no right. Her words were loud, on the verge of desperation. She walked up to the policeman and grabbed his arm tightly. We won't let you continue this. But the gesture only elicited a more aggressive reaction. The policeman pushed her away, leaving her standing there horrified at what was happening. Walter was still on the ground, his body unmoving as if he was broken, but his eyes were alive. Something more than just pain burned in them. There was a fire there that would not subside, despite everything. The crowd was increasingly filled with people who didn't understand how to react, but knew that if they didn't intervene, they would become part of the pain. People were filming on their phones, shouting, trying to push forward, but each step became more and more impossible. Walter, lying on the pavement, finally raised his hand, sliding his fingers across the dirty concrete. His gaze stopped on his daughter, and in her eyes he saw that she still believed that the world could be just, that it was possible to stop this violence. She looked at him with such sincere hope that it seemed like a final boost of energy for him. But something about that moment was absolutely hopeless. It was a point of no return. Will they all become mere spectators of this nightmare? Those who do not intervene will become part of this evil themselves. Before we continue, let's take one more quick pause. Write in the comments where you are listening to our stories from. Have you had moments in your life that made you feel something similar? Share your thoughts, we care to hear what you think. If you like what we create, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the sequel. And now we continue. That moment when everything in the world seems to freeze, but you feel the air filling with menace, was getting closer and closer. Screams, curses, echoed in the chests of everyone standing in the square. The tension in the air was so thick it felt like it could have been cut with a knife. It seemed that every breath was a gunshot, that every glance could cause an explosion. The people standing around held their breath, realizing that unless something decisive happened now, this situation could end in tragedy. On the pavement, right in front of everyone's eyes, lay Walter, a man who could no longer stand up, could not even move, but his eyes were still burning. Walter's daughter, still standing beside him, as if detached from reality, watched what was happening. There were not only tears in her eyes. There was fear, but even more desperation and a desire to do something. She couldn't take it anymore, couldn't watch her father receive this inhuman pain and humiliation anymore. That moment, when she realized she couldn't just be an observer, was her decision. Stop! She screamed, her voice was not just a scream, but a real scream, full of pain and a desperate desire to protect her father. Stop, You have no right." She stepped forward. It wasn't just a physical movement, it was her decision. There was so much fear in her body that she could hardly breathe, but her eyes stayed fixed on the policeman, who seemed ready for another attack. The policeman looked up. Hatred flashed in his eyes. He couldn't let himself lose control. His rage was becoming more uncontrollable by the second. "Do you have to do it all over again, girl?" His voice was low and threatening. He stepped toward her, his hand already reaching forward, as if he were ready to strike her, to knock the courage out of her. She froze, her breathing becoming ragged, but she didn't back down. She stood before him, like a barrier, like a last line of defense for her father. In that moment, her fear was so vivid that it transformed into strength. The crowd around them froze. People sensed that the situation had crossed the line where nothing would ever be the same. There were no more questions. There were no more places for silence. Everyone realized that the conflict was ready to escalate beyond the limits of what was acceptable. The policeman, seeing her steadfastness, took another step forward, his face contorted with anger. He couldn't believe that this girl dared to stand in his way. His fingers clenched into a fist, and he raised his hand again to strike her, but suddenly his gesture was unsure. For a split second his hand froze in midair, and that moment could have been decisive. But the policeman didn't stop. At that moment, the crowd exploded. The people who had been standing nearby finally broke through to him. They began to shout, shouting words of encouragement to Walter and his daughter, their voices merging into a single rumble. It was like a chain reaction. They could no longer watch, could no longer remain silent as they watched the madness. But the policeman could not let go of his rage. He stepped forward again, and his hand met the girl's face. The blow was so strong that she almost lost her balance, but she held on. Everything around her seemed to freeze. Walter, despite the pain, began to move. His body barely moved, but there was fire in his eyes. He wanted to get up, even though he knew he couldn't. He knew that his daughter needed him, that she could no longer be alone in this hell. His heart was beating louder than ever. The crowd, which could no longer control itself, began to move forward, shouting, demanding justice. Although the policeman and his colleague tried to hold back the crowd, those in the center of the action already knew that everything was about to be decided. Every person who stood up for Walter and his daughter knew that they could be part of something bigger. This was not just a rebellion against one police officer, it was a rebellion against the system. But the policeman still didn't give up. He was like a wild beast losing all willpower, but his rage only inflamed the situation. The moment of truth has arrived. When everything was ready to explode, when the blood was beginning to pool in my eyes, when one blow could lead to something terrible, at that moment, like a shadow, a man appeared. He appeared seemingly out of nowhere, his silhouette looming against the flickering lights and the police car. A low voice with a commanding tone pierced the noise of the crowd, and everyone froze. "Stand back, everybody stand back. Now." The voice was confident, firm, leaving no room for objection. The word sounded like a sentence, but he was not just some passerby, not a bystander. This man was known to everyone, and everyone here felt the tension in the air suddenly become taut, like when ice begins to crack. The man stepped forward, and with every movement he made, those who were ready to rush into the fray retreated. The crowd began to disperse, though not everyone realized what was happening yet. It had been said that he did not interfere in matters, but this moment was different. This moment was momentous. It was Larry Hale, the man whose name everyone knew. He wasn't just one of the powerful men in town, his presence changed everything. And though he'd never sought to be the center of attention, right now his gaze could stop even the toughest storm. Larry was a businessman, but he was most respected for being a man who always found a way to work with those deemed unworthy. He owned businesses, he owned power, but far more importantly, he was someone who was feared. But no one had expected his appearance to become such an imminent threat to this policeman. Larry stepped close to the policeman, his eyes growing colder with each step. He didn't say a word, but there was more power in that silence than in any threat. The policeman stopped. He took a step back, and his confidence began to crumble like sand under pressure. Larry wasn't a big man, but his authority was immense, and with that authority he approached the situation like a game where he knew he was winning. With each step the policeman felt his control slipping away. "Do you have any questions?" Larry finally said, his voice low, but with such weight that no one would dare to object. The policeman said nothing, but his face was pale and his palms were moist. He realized that he was one step away from doing something for which he would not be forgiven. His hands were beginning to tremble. What had seemed like victory was now turning to desperate fear. "Take your hands off him," Larry said to the policeman, pointing at Walter. "You have no right to harm this man. Now you'd better clear the area until I call for service." The policeman, standing in that ominous shadow of authority, realized that everything he had just done would lead to consequences he couldn't even predict. His actions weren't just a mistake, they could be the beginning of the end of his career, and possibly something worse. Larry turned to the crowd and his gaze softened. He looked at the people who stood silent, watching this turn of events. Larry knew that this moment was a turning point. This was the moment he would take things to the next level, not letting this brutality overshadow the city. "Stop it," Larry said, addressing the crowd again. "This man deserves better. And so do all of you." The crowd, a little confused by the sudden intrusion, began to quietly discuss what was happening. Something had changed. This intervention was not just an act of power. It was a moment when everyone realized that there was no more impunity. The policeman stepped back quickly, as if Larry's mere glance had made him lose his power. His partner, too, remained standing still, hesitant to intervene, realizing that he should just back off now. Walter, who was still lying on the ground, at this moment was able to lift himself up, leaning on his arms, and though his body ached, though he did not know what would happen next, he felt that something had changed. He felt strong again. Walter's daughter, who had previously been unable to hold back her tears, now hugged him. There was not only relief in her eyes, but also a great sense of pride in this moment. She saw that justice could still be done, but she also realized that there was still much to be done. Larry stepped back silently, his gaze parting, but determined. He knew this situation would not end so easily. It was only the first step. And deep down, everyone who was here realized that this day was a turning point in the history of this town. The day after Larry Hale intervened in the conflict, the city fell into an unaccustomed silence. The crowd that had dispersed after the police left the square gradually returned to its normal life. But what had happened had left a mark on people's souls, and the events did not end as everyone had expected. In the morning, new news soon began to emerge. In the evening, immediately after Larry's intervention, the police began their own investigation. But what was revealed was shocking. Footage from various sources appeared on local news. Journalists quickly gained access to video information from surveillance cameras as well as cell phone footage of eyewitnesses, which was quickly disseminated on the internet. The footage was made available to the public and soon attracted the interest of not only local media, but also larger national outlets. One of these videos was a shot where Larry Hale, at that moment standing in the shadows, first observed what was happening in the square without making any visible steps. This came as a shock to everyone who already thought his intervention was purely accidental and harmless. But further on, the footsteps led to something that turned out to be far more disturbing. A local reporter, who at first simply captured the events on video, suddenly noticed strange details. Finding himself on the other side of town, he tracked Larry Hale to a place that had previously been little noticed. That location turned out to be an old, dusty building where Larry told everyone to stand still and stop to talk to some local activists who were known for their political stance. The building, he said, was the headquarters for a private organization that funded numerous campaigns for order in the city. But, as we learned later, the most shocking thing was that Larry was not just an activist, but a private investor who funded projects related to strengthening law enforcement and, among other things, training the police and providing them with the means to deal with minorities in the neighborhood. Rumors have surfaced that he had long been acquainted with high police officials and his intervention in this conflict was not accidental. What was even more shocking was that Larry was associated with several police officers who had long been under suspicion for their brutality with the local population, especially African Americans. What was significant was that despite his role in the business, his personal interests intersected with police brutality in the city. The moment this truth stood up, all eyes were on Larry. Some began to wonder, was his act in the square really a noble intervention? Or was it a devious move to cover up the much more serious and darker deeds behind his actions? Even worse, it was a direct confrontation with what everyone in the city knew: racism doesn't disappear by one man's intervention. Larry Hale, despite his secrecy, became a central figure in the new discussions. His supposedly noble intervention caused great resentment among activists, who began to uncover even dirtier details of his political connections. Over time, it became clear that his goals may not have been as honorable as he tried to portray. Larry found himself at the center of a high-profile investigation that was beginning to gain momentum. It was not just an investigation into a single incident, but rather a revelation of the deeper mechanism of racism and political manipulation that existed in the city. People began to realize that this whole situation was just the tip of the iceberg, an iceberg hiding a much more tragic story. But for Walter and his daughter, this truth was another burden. There was no longer just fear in their daughter's eyes, but a sense that she had finally seen the underbelly of the system in which she had grown up. But this realization was even more agonizing to see how everything they had experienced was part of a much worse game. And in that moment, they witnessed not only tragedy, but something much more important: the realization that there would be no easy way to fight for justice. Each day the investigation deepened, revealing more and more facts. And in a city that once seemed hopelessly broken, new questions began to arise. Questions to which no one knew the answers, but which made everyone wonder how long such tragedies would continue. When the events in the square revealed the underbelly of the story, the city could not be the same. The shock and anxiety that had accompanied the first days after Larry's intervention had grown into something much more serious. The gravity of the tension that had arisen from rising racial tensions had now become a painful truth that could not be ignored. Everyone who witnessed the incident was on the verge of realizing that what happened in the square was only the beginning of the destruction of the illusions that had sustained the system for so long. As Larry Hale's true connections to police officers and his personal interests came to light, people began to wonder, how many more such heroes are hidden behind the facades of the city? How many more people are suffering because the system, itself, is outdated and saturated with hate? Local activists, human rights defenders and ordinary citizens began to fill the streets. Mass protests became a daily reality. At this point, no one could ignore that racism was not just an individual problem, but part of a larger mechanism that had long existed in this community. Questions were being asked about how power and money affected justice, and why so many people were willing to turn a blind eye to what was happening under their noses. Walter and his daughter were at the center of this struggle, but their story became a personal tragedy for them. There was no longer a shadow of calm in their lives. Walter continued to struggle with the effects of his trauma, but his soul was torn between wanting to live and feeling helpless against a system that was destroying everything he loved. His daughter, though strong, could not find peace in what had happened. She was increasingly alone, contemplating what it meant to be part of this city, part of this pain. But it was in that pain that they became part of a larger movement. Soon Walter, despite his fatigue, became one of the symbols of the fight for justice. He not only fought for his own life, but also for those who could not fight for themselves. His participation in the protests attracted attention, but not everyone in the city shared his desire for change. It soon became clear that the consequences were far from just for Walter and his daughter. The story of these events became a litmus test for the city. All those who had supported the status quo became trapped in their own prejudices. Many people who had previously chosen to remain silent or turn a blind eye began to realize that their silence was only exacerbating the problem. There were those who condemned Larry's actions and those who supported him, but there were also those who tried to justify their behavior on the grounds of order and the safety of the city. Local politicians were forced to react. Investigations began, and this was an important step towards possible change. But while the first steps towards investigations promised change, everyone realized that change could not be quick. The fabric of this society was too fragile, and what had happened could not be forgotten or erased from the face of the city. However, despite police recalcitrance and attempts to manipulate the situation, it became apparent that this tragedy changed the lives of Walter, his daughter, and countless others who were drawn into the fight for the truth forever. It wasn't just about what happened in the square. It was about what was going on inside each of us, about how hard it is to realize that what lives inside you is also what you have tried for so long to ignore. It was about struggling with parts of the system that may never be fixed. And now, with every new look, with every new shout in the crowd, people in the city were beginning to realize, this whole situation was not just a random incident, but a system that still needed to be changed. More was needed than just protests or investigations. It was necessary to destroy this system of hatred that had been passed down from generation to generation for centuries. And for Walter, despite the physical pain and mental anguish, this moment was where real resistance begins. No one knew how long the protests would continue, how long the struggle would cost lives, but one thing was certain, this moment was the starting point. With each passing day, the city became more and more edgy. Fear was giving way to determination. Racism could no longer remain invisible. No longer could the system continue to operate in the shadows. And it all started with one decisive step, a step that opened the eyes of many, and perhaps now, finally, is the beginning of the path to truth. What do you think about this story? Have you ever experienced racism in your life? Your thoughts are very important to us and we appreciate each and every one of you. We are always happy to hear your experiences and opinions in the comments, because it helps us move forward and continue to create stories that will move you. If you liked this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and put a like. Wishing you a good day, and may each new step be more conscious. Write in the comments the phrase, "I am with you until the end," so we know that you are listening and experiencing each story with us.